Sam Seder, Emma Vigeland on the Majority Report. Want to welcome to the program Terri Gerstein, director of the Wagner Labor Initiative at New York University. Terri, welcome to the program.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
I saw a piece in the Washington Post 2 weeks ago by Lauren Kaori-Gurley entitled "America is Divided Over Major Efforts to Rewrite Child Labor Laws." And we've been tracking this over the past couple of years, particularly in post-COVID. There are laws that aim to strengthen child labor laws. When we hear about, maybe a kid getting killed doing roofing or at a meat processing plant. And then there's like a dozen states, maybe a little more, that are changing their labor laws to allow children to work more. Before we get into that, give us a sense of like what, from a federal level, and that seems to be more or less the basement, or it used to be, of what we, and states add on to that. But what is the federal law? Like how much can I have an 11-year-old. How much can I put this kid to, starting to bring home some bacon?
Well, so your 11-year-old can set the table and keep the room clean, right? But our child labor laws...
That will come as news to him, but I will tell.
So our child labor laws, you're right, there's laws at the federal and at the state level. And basically, the federal law has two main components. And I think you implicitly raised a very important point, which is that our laws do allow children to work once they're 14. There's a whole host of different kinds of jobs that kids can have. What our child labor laws prohibit is work that is either hazardous, like the most dangerous jobs, not just for kids, but for adults, children are not allowed to perform. And then also it prohibits children from being assigned to work certain hours. And the reason for that is we don't want to have kids working schedules that are so long that it interferes with their education or their development. And so kids who are 14, the hazardous, in terms of the hazardous jobs, there's a list at the federal level. And then most states also have lists. Sometimes those are more comprehensive than at the federal level and cover more types of work or cover entire workplaces instead of specific jobs. And then there are hours limitations, which under federal law for minors who are 16 and up, there aren't any hours limitations, but most states do have those. And then the one additional protection that many states have is that many states also require minors to get a work permit or employment certificate, basically getting permission from the school and from their parents and sort of advising the Department of Labor that they're going to be working and alerting the employer that this child is a minor and therefore special protections apply.
Now, I am I'm very supportive of 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds working. I had a job, I think, starting either 14 or 15 years old. It was well before I could drive. But it was, it was like after school, and it was maybe 4 days a week, maybe 5, but it was no more than 3 or 4 hours, a day. And but this is a whole new thing that we're doing in terms of like what jobs. I want to start with the parental notification and the permitting process, because I do distinctly remember having to have my parents sign something saying I was of a specific age and that I had permission to work. And it occurs to me when I hear particularly the parental stuff, and then when it's like changes into like parental notification, and then I also see like an increase in sort of like the hours and the danger that people are associated with. The first thing that comes to mind for me is this is basically a pro-trafficking law, that this is an attempt by in certain areas that may be dominated by like chicken processors. I'm thinking about Arkansas right now, chicken processors or something like that they want immigrant children to be able to work there, and that the lack of a parental permit is more to give cover to the companies for saying like, we didn't know, how could we possibly know this person was 14, 13, 12 and didn't have parents here?
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally a little reluctant to speculate about their motives, but there certainly are employer associations that have been backing these rollbacks and pushing for them, as well as an organization, a lobbying group, the Foundation for Government Accountability in Florida, and other dark money groups. I do think that it's very, there's a lot of sort of confusion and old rationalizations that are being given for the reason for rolling back these laws, like in relation to the work permit issue. During the rollback conversations about that, it was rolled back in Arkansas. There was discussion about how this should be up to parents. And it's so nonsensical because the work permit process requires the minor to get the parent's signature, right? So it just literally does not make sense. And then some of the justifications have been, I read recently someone's academic paper about, the initial restraints on child labor a century ago. And some of the opponents said, well, there'll be children who are idle. And now there's sort of the same thing about this will get them off of their screens. But these changes really do put kids at risk. The work permit process, it's often painted as just sort of some government bureaucracy. But what the work permit process does is it keeps everyone in the picture alert, the employer, the school, the parents, the Department of Labor, that this is a minor and that there are additional protections involved. And in fact, Maine reported that when they got work permit applications, a number of them were rejected because the work was hazardous. And so in that case, it actually prevented violations. And most of the work permit, the paperwork actually lists the child labor laws on them, and the employer, so it actually literally, the application process makes everyone involved aware of what the law is and how to find out more. So it really has a preventive feature to it.
So there's a preventive feature to I just want because I want to drill down this, and without, I understand you don't want to impart motivations on people, but do we have data? In other words, do we know? Absolutely. When you're talking about 14 and 15 and 16-year-olds who are working, it's one thing, like I say, I went to the 5 and dime, literally, I think it was called the 5 and 10, and, clean bathrooms or restock inventory or something like that. That's all well and good. This was not, difficult stuff. But if I'm, working as a roofer or if I'm working around heavy machinery, I mean, do we have statistics on how many 14, 15, 16-year-olds are working with parents who are local? When these laws, when they basically are, essentially allowed to work without a permit. And I get that, yes, this permitting process makes everybody accountable. It adds liability, I bet, for the parents but particularly the employer, because they have to be made aware that there are restrictions on what kind of danger and hours they can put these kids in. But do we have any sense, or are we just completely driving blind here in terms of who's actually filling these positions when a work permit gets rescinded, or I should say repealed?
Right. So, who is filling these? So statistics on the increase in violations, I believe the U.S. Department of Labor reported an 88% increase in violations over the past several years. And that includes both hazardous industries, hazardous work, as well as hours violations. And then some states have reported that as well. And then the question you asked about, who are doing these jobs, in a lot of cases, they are unaccompanied minors, they're immigrant children, they're especially, immigrants are especially vulnerable in general at work because of fear of retaliation, fear of potential immigration consequences, a whole host of reasons that present obstacles for people to report violations. And then children are also especially vulnerable just based on their age and lack of experience, and deference to adults who are not their parents. And so then when you have immigrant children, they're just at really, really heightened vulnerability. And some of the worst cases that we've seen in the media in reporting in the New York Times, for example, has involved immigrant children. But, not all of these violations do involve immigrant children. And, there was a period last summer, over a 5-week period, there were 3 16-year-olds, 16-year-old boys who were killed on the job doing hazardous work. And 2 of those boys were not immigrants. And the New Jersey, DC, and Massachusetts AG's offices have found massive child labor violations in relation to hours at Chipotle, and have fined them millions of dollars. And that again is probably like a broader range of minors. But I think your question about the motivations, we have there's a term, the fissured workplace, that David Weil, who headed wage and hour enforcement over Obama, came up with, which talks about when there's a lead corporation that's like the household name multinational we've all heard of, and they use a business model where they subcontract, and then the subcontractor uses a staffing agency. And some of the worst violations that we've seen in the meat packing plants, for example, or poultry processing, have happened in this kind of fissured business model. And so I think it's a situation where the people at the top, it's not like they're necessarily super consciously setting out to say, I want to have human trafficking victims, in our cleaning our slaughterhouses, but rather they're setting themselves up with a business model that allows them to deflect responsibility and just sort of cover their eyes and ears and say, I didn't know anything, so it's not my fault, and I have no accountability.
It's also why these Republican state legislatures are trying to eliminate some of these paperwork requirements for these companies, because then there's really no paper trail for some of these violations, it appears. And I'm in shock that there is this kind of federal framework basically saying that children should not be able to work in jobs deemed dangerous, and I'd imagine that covers meat processing and meat packing and things like that. But Iowa and their Republican governor signed a law basically completely flouting that. And if I'm getting the state right from the piece, saying no, children can work in meat processing plants. You're the expert. Is that true? And if so, like how is that not in violation of federal guidelines and federal law?
So that's such an interesting question. So the federal law, as we talked about at the outset, is a floor, not a ceiling. So every employer has to comply with the federal law, and then states are free to pass stronger laws. And most of them have. So in some of the cases when states are doing these rollbacks, in some cases they're rolling back their additional state protections and just to the federal level. But in Iowa, as you noted, I don't remember if it included meat packing, but it does allow teens as young as 14 to do formerly prohibited hazardous jobs in industrial laundries, or as young as 15 to do light assembly work, and also allows the state to waive certain restrictions on hazardous work for 16 and 17-year-olds in a list of hazardous occupations. And so this does raise the question, isn't the state, the way I understand this is that these employers still have to comply with state law. The state doesn't undo the federal law. So really the state, in my mind, the legislators think they're doing employers a favor by weakening the laws, but really what they're doing is putting them on a path toward endangering children, which is the most important thing, but also B, from a self-interest perspective for the employers, putting them on a path to violate federal law. But these employers could be thinking that they're complying with state law, but in fact find themselves having penalties under federal law.
But do we have, and as I read this piece too, 16 states have one or more bills that could weaken their child labor laws. 13 are seeking to strengthen them. You cited the AGs in Massachusetts and a couple other states. I don't know if I would bet everything I own on it, but I would come close that those 16 states are dominated by Republican legislatures, and those 13 states are dominated by Democratic legislatures, which means, and I would imagine too, that the AGs out of those states are reflective of whatever the will is. So if you got a place like Iowa where the state law is actually subterranean to the basement of federal law. And like you said, that exposes the employers to certain liability. But is there a federal apparatus? I mean, because I would imagine we have been operating for decades, for the most part, where the feds don't have to worry about anything going below the basement because everything was in a state was either at that basement or higher in terms of standards. And the state AGs, they would have primary responsibility and the best, it seems to me, position to assess whether those laws are being broken. But is it OSHA? Is it the Labor Department? Who is it that would police this? And do they even have the enforcement resources? Because it seems to me for decades, they haven't had to exert those resources to the extent that they would have to now in those 16 states that may have dropped their standards.
So there's a whole lot of different questions sort of embedded in that one question. I mean, as an initial matter, we have grossly insufficient resources to enforce our workplace laws, from child labor laws to minimum wage to workplace safety and health, to the laws that give workers the right to form and join unions. Really, this is just one more example of the public sector having been shrunken just totally inappropriately. So to give one example, the U.S. Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division, which enforces not only child labor laws, but also the minimum wage law, overtime, Family and Medical Leave Act, a whole bunch of laws. For the entire country at the end of 2023, they had 733 staffers for the whole country. That's 500 fewer than in the 1970s when the economy was significantly smaller. So that's just one example. OSHA is similarly grossly understaffed. At the state level, you're absolutely right. There are some states, the states that care about workers, that do have more robustly funded state labor departments or state AGs that take on workers' rights. But in some states, there's just like a couple of people who do wage and hour enforcement. In Florida, they don't even have a state Department of Labor, and the state AG does nothing in relation to enforcing workers' rights. So this is another one of those situations where it's kind of like a tale of two countries in terms of the resources, at the state level, the resources that are devoted to these issues. In terms of where the laws are being strengthened and weakened, generally, yes, it is in conservative states where there are conservative legislatures that the laws are being weakened. Although I would note that Virginia, for example, passed a bill this year increasing the penalties from $1,000 to $2,000, still grossly insufficient, but double what it was, right, for child labor violations, and that was signed by the governor. And then there are some conservative states that have not, haven't really had any rollbacks to date, like Oklahoma, for example, hasn't had any movement to roll back child labor laws. But overall, you're absolutely right that this is sort of playing out in somewhat of a partisan way, and also that the resources to enforce the law are grossly insufficient, both at the federal and state level.
How did child labor laws intersect with child abuse law? Or is it just strictly treated under kind of worker law or labor law?
That's a really interesting question. So generally, it's treated separately, although before my current position, I was the Labor Bureau Chief in the New York AG's office, and we did bring a couple of child labor criminal prosecutions, and one of them did involve some harming a minor, endangerment of a minor charges, which is different from child abuse, but still sort of along similar lines. I think it's an interesting question because in some places, conservatives have sought to pursue the parents for these violations, which, and in fact, I think one of the step parents or parents of a minor profiled in the New York Times story was arrested and later deported. And my own belief, based on the years that I spent many years enforcing workers' rights laws in New York State at the AG's office and the Labor Department. I believe that this is really, really dangerous policy and will drive child labor violations even more into the shadows because it will make people more fearful about reporting violations. You know, a lot of times, all the years I was enforcing labor laws, employers often said, well, what we need is not enforcement. We need more education, right? And, you know, that is, I'm that's not the approach that we took in the administrations that I worked. We were very focused on aggressive enforcement. But I think in relation to parents, with regard to child labor laws, the companies need enforcement, not education. The employers need enforcement. The parents need education and support. And, you know, one serious problem is a lot of the minors in the unaccompanied minor situation or in immigrant minors, they don't have work permits, although they might be eligible for them. And so that means that it's harder for them to get employment with law-abiding employers. So even though they do need, you know, in many cases to earn money to help support their families, there are employers and jobs that they can have if they're 14. It's just the difficulty in getting a work permit makes that harder.
And makes it harder for them to get somewhere safe, I guess, and not be exploited in that instance. Terri Gerstein, director of the Wagner Labor Institute at New York University. Thanks so much for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.